This is Law Bytes, a podcast with Michael Geist.
After 3 days of intense negotiations between EU member states and the European Parliament, lawmakers reached an agreement on Friday on a framework to regulate artificial intelligence. It is the first text of its kind in the world, and the political agreement is expected to promote innovation in Europe while limiting the potential abuses of these advanced technologies.
The regulation of artificial intelligence has emerged as the issue over the past year as the explosive growth of ChatGPT and other generative AI services have sparked legislation, lawsuits, and national consultations. The European Union has been working to assume the pole position when it comes to AI regulation. Late last December, a deal was struck on the EU AI Act, which is heralded as the first of its kind and a model for Canadian AI regulation. Luca Bertuzzi is a Brussels-based tech journalist who was widely regarded as the leading source of information and analysis about the ongoing negotiations involving the EU AI Act. Luca joins me on the podcast to explain the European process, the ongoing opposition that comes from some countries, and the future steps for AI regulation in Europe. Luca, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you, Michael, for having me.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you've come on. You I think, were unquestionably the leading source of information for many of the legislative ups and downs that took place with the EU AI Act. And so thank you for that. As you may know, Canada has its own artificial intelligence bill, and it has said that it wants to largely follow the EU model. And so given that it's that approach, I think it's important, certainly in Canada, to better understand what that model is. And of course, I think people around the world have been looking to the EU and the so-called Brussels effect at times on some of these digital policies to see what's coming out and where some of these regulations may be headed in the future. Why don't we start with a bit of a background on the EU AI Act? Of course, the regulation of AI has been capturing a lot of attention right now, but can you take us back a little bit? When was this introduced, and what sort of process led up to the negotiations that concluded towards the end of last year?
Right. So, and I know the Canadian law. I've been to an event organized by the Spanish presidency in November, and there were quite a few folks from Canada. Lots of interest on the AI from there. So I've been following the AI Act from the start when it was first proposed in April 2021. I can tell you then the overall attitude was very different. People were saying, this is new technology. Why do you want to regulate? Doesn't make sense. And then after ChatGPT was publicly launched and, generative AI exploded, the mood was, now it's too late. This is moving too fast. How are you going to catch up? So, I think we can say a lot of bad things about the EU, but it has shown a lot of vision in terms of what will be the future of technology and what should be regulated. Just to give you an idea, this legislation follows a rather traditional approach because it's based on product safety legislation. The deal here is that the EU is basically saying we want to use this technology, but at our conditions. So, for example, if there is an AI application that we consider is not acceptable in our society, we are just going to ban it. And that's what they are doing for social scoring, this practice of social control that is common in China, other types of technique like manipulating people with disabilities and so on. So that is one of the big categories that is identified in the AI Act. The other big category are AI systems that pose a significant risk to people's fundamental rights or health and safety. So, for example, if you use an AI to select potential employees, you want to make sure, that you are not discriminating against people of color, for example, because the AI systems is trained on a biased database. If you use AI to manage critical infrastructure, you want to be extra sure that the system is robust and flawless. So it's quite basic things. If you think about it, and this idea is to provide extra safety for these sort of technologies. Then the third category that joined later in the game, because as I said, ChatGPT was not a thing when the AI Act was first conceived, is foundation models and general purpose AI systems like ChatGPT. Here it was a bit of a contentious point on how to regulate something that is really fast moving. The most promising part of artificial intelligence, as far as we know now. But at the end, it appeared politically unfeasible not to regulate foundation models, simply because, these are very powerful types of AI. And also there is a question of value chain, because large language models are produced by a handful of companies at the moment. Some of them are the wealthiest companies of the world. So it just made sense to put some rules also at the origin of at the source, rather than just putting all the obligations on the downstream providers, which could be an SME using ChatGPT and adapting it for its own purpose. Okay. So that's in a nutshell.
Okay, interesting. So as I understand it, it's a risk-based analysis. There are some kinds of AI that are simply so risky. You mentioned the social scoring as an example, that they're just unacceptable and they're banned. Others that are viewed as high risk. And so there's an assortment of rules that are associated if you are designated as a high risk system. And now we've got this additional, in effect, category that's focused on this emergence of generative AI. Is that roughly how the EU is trying to approach this emergence of AI, essentially as a consumer product, as you indicated?
Yes, that's correct. And then, of course, there are products that are low risk, that are like, say, your spam filter in your mailbox, and basically there are no rules for those.
Okay, interesting. Now you mentioned that that necessarily involves some of the wealthiest companies in the world. I think that's quite true. Many of them are, of course, U.S. companies. How did they respond to what was taking place? We've just seen in Canada active engagement from some of those companies, active lobbying on several bills, on streaming, on news. What was their engagement when it came to AI regulation in Europe?
Well, it's quite common to see private companies, profit-driven companies, to say one thing publicly and another thing privately. So, we have seen a hearing in the US Congress of CEOs of these AI startups saying, please do regulate us. We need the legal certainty and so on. And then when you look at for example, the position that OpenAI shared with the Commission, they said exactly the opposite. Do not regulate us. You don't understand this technology. You are just going to hamper innovation and so on. So the thing in Brussels is that there is a very anti-big tech sentiment that has been growing probably ever since the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And so, every time a big tech company says something, they take it with more than a pinch of salt. What we have seen regarding the foundation models is that there was active lobbying from European startups that actually did the job for big tech. So big tech didn't have to lift a finger because European companies were doing the work for them. These are companies like Mistral AI, Aleph Alpha, that are very closely linked with the government of their countries, so France and Germany, and that pushed for a much more light touch approach to foundation models. The rules for these models were watered down at the end, but they are still covered. So there will be mostly transparency rules for them.
Interesting. Can you expand a bit on that? So it's interesting. So it was European companies that had concerns or expressed concerns about the prospect of what they would see as overregulation and found themselves essentially in alignment with some of the larger US players. What was being proposed when it came to some of those kinds of technologies, and where did they end up landing?
So the idea here was that basically Europe has still a fighting chance for what concerns foundation models. Indeed, these are quite promising AI startups that are raising millions. And the argument was that, well, basically, if you want to shape a technology, it's much better to be the one that develops it than the one that regulates it. And I mean, there is some sense in that argument, but it's not that innovation and regulation are, necessarily incompatible. So what France and Germany proposed was essentially self-regulation. So codes of conduct that could, at a later stage, lead to some hard rules. This was politically not acceptable for the European Parliament in particular, that pushed for hard rules for these models from the start. And at the end, there are quite basic obligations for these models, like in terms of transparency, show us the data you use to train your model, show us how much energy you use to train your model. You have to make sure that the model is, cyber secure and so on. So at the end, it's quite basic rules. Still, these startups were making a fuss saying, they would be on a back foot to compete with big tech. But that's where we landed.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned both France and Germany. Is that roughly how things broke down, with France and Germany opposing, particularly in this area, stronger rules, preferring the kinds of codes and that you've just suggested? Were there other countries who were actively engaged? And if you can, from afar, I'm certainly accustomed to thinking of France as being one of the most aggressive when it comes to regulating in the technology space. It's surprising to hear that it found itself on the opposite side when it came to this issue.
Well, it's easy to regulate when it's not your companies that are concerned, right? Indeed, I would agree with your assessment that France is usually quite aggressive. So it was a bit, there was also a discussion whether this position was opportunistic. For what concerns Germany, we should distinguish. Germany is a complicated country. They have a coalition government, and some ministry are more pro-business, some are more pro-consumer protection. So at the end, pretty much they annul each other. Italy was brought on board, but this was more part of G7 discussions on AI and industrial cooperation. Since Italy doesn't have a national champion or a strong AI startup, it was also not worth the risk of, just blocking the whole agreement. So at the end, it was pretty much France looking for enough allies to block everything, and they didn't manage.
Interesting. I mean, your point that it's easier to take a hardline pro-regulation approach when you're regulating other companies or other countries coming out of these issues is well taken. Were there some European countries that have made or have advanced significantly when it comes to AI, but yet still found themselves on a pro-regulation approach, or did it really break down those that have who see themselves as potential global leaders were somewhat reticent to move forward with some of these rules, and those that are essentially price takers, the consumer perspectives were the ones that won out?
Well, France and Germany are certainly the countries that in Italy have enough. Sorry, I'll rephrase that. France and Germany are certainly the countries that have an internal market that is large enough to create some national champions that can compete at the international level. They both have an active industrial policy, so it's really not surprising to see a lot of startups emerging from these two countries. Then, of course, there are other digital front runners in the EU, like Estonia, home of Skype, of Bolt. You have Ireland that hosts a lot of big tech companies headquarters, European headquarters. So, of course, there were other voices in this debate, but I would say, yeah, France and Germany were the strongest.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, in December, for anyone who was kind of watching this from the outside, there was this deep debate around what was called the trilogue process, questions about deadlines. Was it going to happen? Wasn't going to happen? I must admit, I found it all a bit confusing as to these efforts trying to strike a deal. Can you explain a little bit what was taking place at that time, and then what ultimately led to a deal?
Yeah, sure. I suppose not many people are familiar with EU jargon. So a trilogue is essentially the three main EU institutions, so the European Commission, which is the executive branch, and the European Parliament and the EU Council, so which are the co-legislators. So the European Parliament is made up of directly elected MEPs, and the EU Council is made up of European governments. So there was significant political pressure to reach an agreement in December. Why? Because we have elections in June, which basically means that the time to adopt and pass legislation was now. So there was technically not enough time to continue the discussions in January, because already with the agreement in December, they only finished the fine-tuning of the text now. So it took more than 1 month. There was I won't bother you with all the internal dynamics, but there was strong pressure to finish this from the Commission, because, of course, this is their proposal. Politicians need a victory to campaign on. So everyone had an interest in finishing this, except perhaps the countries I mentioned before that had an interest in derailing the whole process.
Okay. Now you mentioned that it's taken about a month to come together with the text as we record this. You've just leaked the final version, which I think clocks in at nearly 900 pages. Can I ask, why was there a need for a leak? What is this process supposed to look like in the aftermath of the agreement that was reached to the end of last year?
Well, of course, there are formal steps for passing a law. One of these is for the approval at ambassador level in the EU Council. This is planned for the 2nd of February. And I mean, as a journalist, my job is to deliver news as soon as possible before a document is made public. I try to obtain it before and publish it if I can. So, it would have been published eventually, but like this, people have more time to look at it.
Okay. No, I think it was great. It was great that you're able to put it out in the public space that way. Can you discuss a little bit what does come next? You mentioned the EU ambassadors meeting in February. I can recall about a decade ago being quite involved in the ACTA discussions around the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement, which all led up to a vote at the European Parliament. It was like in early July where uh, they ultimately voted it down and said that the EU wasn't going to join on to that. What further approvals are needed for this document before it actually passes, but becomes law?
Yeah, so just to clarify, once the EU ambassadors adopt the text, it cannot change anymore. So there might still be some tweaks on the text that I shared publicly, but once the ambassadors adopt it, it won't be changed anymore. Following that, indeed, there is the plenary at the European Parliament that needs to approve it. And following that, it will be at ministerial level. So European ministries representing their governments will have to adopt it. Then it will be published on the official journal. And usually it takes 21 days for it to come into force. Then the timeline, it's quite segmented. We have, since the entry into force, the bans that I mentioned will enter into application. They will start to apply. Then we have 1 year for the obligations on foundation models, and then 2 years for the rest. So it will take quite some time. It will be probably in the first half of 2026 that the whole of the AI Act will enter into application.
Okay, so it's going to take some time before it takes full effect. As a conclusion, particularly given the Canadian debate, the debate we see in a lot of countries, there's no question that EU leadership on a range of areas, the GDPR, of course, being, I think, probably the most prominent, but more recently, the DSA, the DMA, has had significant influence on the policy debates around digital related issues in countries around the world. To what extent was some of the urgency around the AI Act fueled by the sense of a genuine need to go ahead and regulate? You mentioned they were ahead of the game compared to many others, and how much of this is a desire to, do you think, create or be a leader when it comes to establishing global models for regulation, including AI, that others might follow?
Well, Brussels is a legislative machine. There is a strong inertia from the EU institution to produce more and more laws. I think that as far as the digital space goes, the EU has been rather successful in establishing itself as the digital regulator. I think if the GDPR success is to continue and to expand to the AI area, the EU will have to show that it means business in terms of enforcing these laws and not just moving the post with new ones. Indeed, there is also a sense of we are leading the way and setting the international benchmark. And it's not only that. I mean, yeah, indeed, Canada is looking at the EU, and probably other jurisdictions will too. There is also the so-called Brussels effect. So what will happen when AI providers have to comply with the AI Act? Will they create different applications for the European market as opposed to other markets, or will they keep the same standard for everyone? I think this is a key question, and if we see more and more jurisdiction like the Canadian one passing similar laws, then I think it's fair to think that we will see this as the new international standard. So I hope that answered your question.
It does, and I think you're right that in many ways there's obviously a lot of momentum around AI regulation, and in some ways, this particular piece of legislation has a real likelihood of having significant amount of influence. Of course, not just within the EU in terms of operations there, but the way that many other jurisdictions look at it. Luca, you've been at the forefront in trying to ensure that people understand and can follow what's taking place, and I'm grateful for that work and grateful for you taking the time to join me on the podcast to help break it down here today.
My pleasure.
That's the Law Bytes podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbytes@pobox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @LawBytesPod or Michael Geist @mgeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe via RSS at Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bytes podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for the clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes for this episode at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.